So Guru graduated in 2015, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
2015 BTech, and that
Yes.
was, yeah, and we were really energetic bunch of students, and so I was remarking earlier to people, so I'll probably just remark some of those and then hand it over to the others for a better and probably more formal introduction. So Guru in his second year was part of this. Had a C5 project from biotech. It was probably one of the first C5 projects from biotech. He was remarking about it a little earlier on. So that was one thing, and he had an extraordinarily good BTP. And I remember his course project in systems biology was also quite good. I just looked it up. It was something on HIV modeling. I just refreshed my memory, and really nice. So a lot of high quality academic work throughout, and a lot of engagement in things like, we didn't have a biotech research club at that point of time, but we had a systems synthetic biology special interest group. I remember Guru and a lot of his classmates were super into about it, and we used to have alternate week presentations and things like that. He was also part of the biomod competition, doing something about, I think, DNA staples and stuff like that, if I remember right. So lots of cool stuff that he and his classmates were into. And I'm very pleased to say that most of them are doing PhDs. Some of them have defended their PhDs already. Some of them are very close to defending their PhDs, and really extraordinary work. And Guru, I really been trying to recall, there was something very fun about you during your masters. I forget it. There's some funny incident I'm not able to recall. It's something about learning dance or something. I don't remember. Everybody was feeling. I can't recall it.
Correct. How are you coming about this, sir?
I don't know. It was some.
I see.
So I had to pull your leg as well after, So nice. So I'll now hand it over to one of the others for the more formal introduction. So thanks, Guru. Really look forward to listening from you.
No, thank you so much for the opportunity, sir. What a wonderful introduction. I'm so grateful that we have such wonderful faculty in IIT Madras. Because of faculty like you, we were enthralled and kind of excited to work because we had a great support group like you. So definitely it's like hand in hand. So thank you so much. And thank you for coming like 8 p.m. I know it's pretty late also in India. So thanks for joining me, and I'll be happy to hear more feedback and everything.
Sure. Hey, so Sahana, who's going to introduce him? So you can talk.
I'll introduce him. Yeah.
Yes.
I'll give probably a bit formal introduction about Guruprasad. So welcome everyone to another session of Alumni Talk series hosted by Biotech Research Club. Today we have with us Guruprasad, who was an alumnus of the batch 2015. Guruprasad is currently pursuing his PhD from Caltech in bioengineering and applied mathematics. I think he's on the verge of completion of his PhD also. So Guruprasad got his BTech from here at IITM from the Department of Biotechnology. After his BTech, he went on to pursue his master's MS from Carnegie Mellon University, and after that. He's currently working in his graduate PhD work, and he's also the CEO and the co-founder of a company called Noisy Nets. Apart from this, Guruprasad also has been the CTO of a company called Visca. So he's also done multiple internships at NCBS Bangalore, at Kyoto University, Japan. And he's been the recipient of multiple honors and awards, like the John Stark Fellowship, and he's also been awarded the Honda Young Scientist and Young Engineer Award. So I think he's the most versatile speaker BRC has hosted in quite a bit. So thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you.
No, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I don't think I'm worthy of that introduction, but let's hope that this presentation, I hope some people learned some things from it, and I learned more from the interaction itself. So I will start presenting now. Let's see. Okay. All right. Do you see my entire screen? And let's see if I see full screen. Is this visible?
Yes.
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 Okay, perfect. Great. Okay, thank you so much for joining this talk and calling me and giving me the opportunity to share my talk. So my work is primarily in, I would say the title for this talk is towards growing autonomous life forms in silico. And my advisor, I work in the Thomson lab, my advisor is Matt Thompson. So first question is, what comes to mind when we think of intelligence? And the first thing that comes to mind is, superhuman intelligence like Albert Einstein and the 3-pound brain that he possessed. Well, right now it's actually, we actually have a stock photo of his brain because it was preserved to actually understand what was in there actually that actually enabled that intelligence. And the other thing that comes to mind when we think of intelligence is, all the way in the future, like a robot revolution, for instance, where you have robots that can speak to each other, work with each other, help us in any way and every way possible, and be really extremely, I would say, efficient personal assistants. That's slightly in the future, but what we have now is contemporary intelligence, which is like AlphaGo. So many of you would have heard of AlphaGo, and AlphaGo is basically one of the, I would say, powerful AI systems that was built by DeepMind, and that defeated Lee Sedol, who is a Go champion. So Go is a very, very complex game. It's even more complex, and because it has a larger number of strategies than chess. So having a machine that can actually beat Go champion Lee Sedol was a pretty big feat. And another contemporary, I would say, victory is the recent GPT-3 machines. So OpenAI is a firm that Elon Musk founded, and they built one of the biggest AI systems again ever, which has like close to 1 billion parameters. So GPT-3 is it's a natural language processing device, and it can function. It's basically like a personal assistant. So you can ask any question to GPT-3, and it will give you some coherent, useful answer. It understands English language pretty well. Now, having talked about all these powerful systems, let's go behind the scenes and try to see, because I'm interested in trying to build on these systems, and I want to understand if these systems can ever come to a point where we can mimic human intelligence. I'd like to see what are the challenges these systems face. One is...
Hi, really sorry about interrupting. Could you press hide in the bottom, like near?
Oh, okay. Okay, sure. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Cool. So one of the major challenges is it's extremely difficult to build and train these systems, and it requires a lot of handcrafting and hand tuning to actually have a good functioning system. And why do I say that? It's because, say for instance, we have a lot of machine learning frameworks like PyTorch and TensorFlow, but then if you actually want to train it for a reasonably real life data set, then you'd actually have to handcraft a good architecture, a good initial architecture, before you can actually apply a learning rule and train the network. So it needs some amount of hand tuning. The other thing is it requires a huge amount of training samples. So the training samples are of two kinds. One is you just have raw data, and the other thing is you have labeled data. Labeled data is extremely expensive to get as well. So there's this whole company called Figure 8, where their only job is to actually annotate data. And IBM spends close to hundreds and thousands of dollars for labeling every data set that they have. So it's an extremely expensive, and these data and machine learning requires like large data sets to even train to come to some level of, I would say, conceptual understanding. They're brittle. When I say brittle, I mean you can actually find really small perturbations that can cause the system to that can actually damage the system. Where I mean, say for instance, if I change like 10 weights, the network has I don't know, 1 million parameters, and if I change like 5 parameters in even by a small amount, I could actually, if they are targeted, I can actually cause the downfall of the entire system. So an accuracy from 95% could come down to 30%, and they are pretty brittle with respect to that. The other thing is they do not adapt to changing input data structures. What I mean by that is, say for instance, you have a network that is currently analyzing data from a 1 megapixel camera. So currently, if you think of a camera, you have like a CCD array, which is like a 2D frame, and you have pixels started in the CCD array, and data is flowing in this 2D format. But say, for instance, I want to change my camera array. I want to have a different camera array, which probably, let's say, an omnidirectional camera, which currently drones use. Now, you would have to not just retrain your network, but you'd have to rebuild your entire network, because your network cannot even know, it doesn't even know how to interpret the kind of data the kind of input data structures that you're feeding your network. And finally, the world around us is dynamic, but what the network sees is, or what currently machine learning systems are built to understand or to analyze, is mostly static inputs. So if we have like real-time feed and you want to make real-time inferences, machine learning currently is not yet there in some sense. A very stark example I came across this recently is, I cannot make, if I'm crossing the road, I need to basically make the inference right there and right then. I cannot be making an inference 5 minutes later. So, and inferring in real time is possibly still possible by machine learning systems, but then learning in real time is still far out. Now, I'll give you some specific examples. So the machine that I was talking about, GPT-3, it requires like 10 trillion sentences to learn. And what does it, and it's basically, if 10 trillion is a weird number. So say, for instance, the entire data set, 0.1% of that entire data set is the whole Wikipedia. So you can imagine how large a data set would one require to actually train such a large machine. So it needs, whereas if for communicating, like as an individual, I've never read the entire Wikipedia, but none of us have actually, possibly, none of us possibly have read the entire Wikipedia. So we can still communicate, we can still generalize pretty well, we can still understand and interpret the world pretty reasonably. So that is something that's off in the way we are training or in the way we are approaching large-scale AI systems. The other thing is the cost of training one such machine, if we know the right architecture, is close to $10 million, or probably more. And the power consumption is out of the charts. So it's like 190,000 kilowatt hour, which basically translates to a car driving 700,000 kilometers. So now when we think of, if I want to take AI to the next step, is this the right way to keep progressing? Or should I maybe take a step back and try to build something simpler, but probably from a different, I would say, a different point of view, a different paradigm? Do we need a paradigm shift is probably something that is worth asking at this point. Mainly because we also need to care about sustainability, and we need to care about, if I want to get to human intelligence, but without 10 trillion sentences, how do I get there? Or is there a way to get there? And when we face problems, we always go back to natural systems. We always look at biological systems, because somehow biology, thanks to so many millions of years of evolution, has solved some of these issues. So we look back at the brain. And so the question is, how are brains different? How are brains different from today's AI systems? There are many ways it's different. So first of all, brains are made out of organic matter. You have neurons, you have astrocytes, microglia, and all those, all different kinds of components. Whereas AI systems are silicon based. But rather than looking at those differences, I'm interested in. I will describe the hobby project that I'm working on, and maybe that's probably a question that I'm trying to answer at some point. But what I'm interested in is the principles that actually differ between what brains are, or how brains function, versus how today's AI systems function. The first thing is, brains wire themselves. So we, as humans, we basically grow from a single cell, a zygote, and we grow and we self-organize connectivity, and you have this entire beautiful functioning machine, called the brain, that just manifests before you, or when you're a child. So whereas AI systems, on the other hand, need hand tuning, hand crafting. There is before it actually gets to a point where you can train it to learn statistics of the world. The other thing is, brains are pretty resilient to damages, and they repair themselves. So what I mean by that is, currently, as I'm speaking, there are changes in my synaptic connectivity, small changes here and there, but then for the most part, my speech is pretty coherent. So it means that there are mechanisms that are always in place to make sure my functional connectivity or functional performance remains stable as my brain architecture undergoes small changes. And repairing, actually, there's a whole group here in Caltech where the group's name is Carlos Lois. We've collaborated a bit. So they work on songbirds, and they make specific songbirds are those birds that they have like very stereotypical song patterns. So, and the young one learns it from its parent, and you can actually perturb those song circuits. And you'll notice that after like 5 days of not being able to sing, it'll bounce back, even though it hasn't heard its parent or anyone else's singing. So it's like there's a stored copy somewhere, and then afterwards it rebuilds its circuit and it comes back and starts singing the same song. So they're extremely resilient and they repair themselves very quickly. And of course, they're super power efficient. Back of the hand envelope calculation, I think it says that it states that it comes to around maybe the brain's power consumption is like 10 watts, which is pretty efficient as compared to current day AI systems. So I'll be touching only on one particular idea. I'll be talking only about brain wiring itself. The other parts, actually, if people are interested, I'm happy to like send a paper, and we've done some work on that front as well. So I'd be happy to discuss it maybe some other time or offline as well. Okay, so that our inspiration. So how does the brain grow? Here's a small video that basically talks about how brains or particular systems in the brain, like the cortex, grows from a single cell. So you have a bunch of stem cells in the ventricle, and these stem cells in the ventricle first differentiate into these scaffolds. So you see these scaffolds, these are the radial glial scaffolds, and further on, the stem cells further differentiate to form other kinds of neurons, like the cortical neurons, and they start climbing these scaffolds. So it's in a radial fashion. So these cells, they hold on to these scaffolds, they climb up, and they start layering themselves. So what we see is when we talk about the cortex and we talk about layered systems, these are how these layered systems are built. So you have a pool of stem cells in the ventricle. They start differentiating at different points, and and as they become neurons, they start climbing up these scaffolds, and they start layering themselves. The ones in the lowest layer are the oldest neurons, and the ones in the highest layer are the youngest neurons. So a couple of questions one can ask a couple of questions as we see this. One is, we need a flexible architecture that allows for small mistakes during development. So biological systems are prone to making mistakes, or there could be some errors at any point. So there should be an architecture that should be flexible enough to allow for these small mistakes during development. And the second thing is that these systems, they wire up robustly. Part of it, so each and every neuron, for instance, every neuron has some connection with the other. Like there is a very well laid out adjacency matrix, which means all neurons are somehow connected in some fashion, and this connectivity is partly controlled by genetics, but a lot of it is controlled by spontaneous activity. And I'll get into detail of what the spontaneous activity itself is, and we are specifically interested in spontaneous activity. Okay. So again, coming back to the question is, given some precursor units, is it possible for us to self-assemble or self-organize an entire computer? So I'm going to now dig down to one specific subsystem that caught our interest. It is specifically the visual system. So when we think of visual systems, so visual neuroscience is a very well-studied area, much better than other areas in neuroscience itself. So when we think of visual system, we think of the eyes or the retina, and information flowing from the retina to this area called the LGN, or the lateral geniculate nucleus. Then information from lateral geniculate nucleus feeds forward to the occipital lobe, which is in the back of the brain, which has the visual cortex, where you have layers V1, V2, V3. It's a layered structure. And it terminates all the way in the IT cortex. So people have heard of the Jennifer Aniston neuron or have heard of grandmother neurons. I mean, there are papers that claim that the Jennifer Aniston neuron actually is found in the IT cortex. Jennifer Aniston neuron basically means that there is one neuron in the brain that actually fires every time anything related to Jennifer Aniston is shown to you, like an image, a name, a thought. That's the neuron that basically fires. All right, coming back. So the idea is you have this visual circuitry laid from the retina to the LGN all the way to the visual cortex. When we look at the anatomy of these structures across individuals in a population, we notice that there are some statistical, there are some connection statistics that are conserved across individuals. One of the things that is conserved is the pooling structure. So when I say pooling, that means there is a spatial clustering from the retina going all the way to the LGN, and which means that if you have the retinal layer here, let me just make sure I have a pointer. So you have a retinal layer here, and you have the LGN layer. So there are a bunch of cells in the retinal layer that pool their connections to a single unit in the LGN. And as soon as I saw the pooling structure that's present in the retina and LGN, the first thing that I was reminded of was pooling operations in deep learning systems. So if you think of convolutional neural networks, one of the most, I would say, widely used neural networks for image processing, the major operations are pooling, convolutions, and all of them are like some sort of pooling operation itself. So I was wondering, so if our brains or if the connectivity in our visual cortex already gives this pooling, the first question is, how does this even get established? Like, what is the is it present in the genetics? Is it there? Is it spontaneous activity driven, or is it that the person sees the world and then afterwards these connections get changed or get modified to become pooling structures? So to answer that question, we looked at when do these structures actually start forming? These pooling structures are formed even before the organism opens his eyes or his or her eyes, which means that even before vision, we can actually see that these structures have been well laid out. So a natural question is, but on the contrary, if you look at AI systems, we build AI systems or we build AI architecture only, which is, well, AI architecture is built dependent on the data. So if the data is of a particular kind, we basically handcraft an AI system in such a way that it is suitable to analyze or process the data. But in our case, in our brains, for instance, we haven't seen the data, we haven't seen the world out there, but our retinas actually are not even sensitive to light at that point while in the mother's womb. But we have a very well laid out architecture that is present. So where is that information coming from? And in the late 90s, this was like hypothesized that the information could be coming from these spontaneous waves that traverse the retina. And I'm just showing a simple diagram of, let's say you have a retinal layer, and this retinal layer is studded with a bunch of cells, like retinal ganglion cells. And you have these retinal ganglion cells are speaking to each other, and because of their noisy communication, there is this spontaneous burst of signal or spatial temporal wave that gets spun up. And this wave starts traversing the retina. And research in the 90s, especially Marcus Meister, who's right now, who was a postdoc at that point, he speculated that this could be a signal for actually wiring different areas in the brain. So this activity or this activity pattern could basically serve as a signal for wiring of different layers. What they did, what Marcus's group did was they basically took a ferret's retina. Ferret is like I would say a modern version of a European polecat, and they took the ferret's retina. They placed it on a microelectrode grid. So this is your microelectrode grid, and these are the cells or neurons in the ferret's retina. And they started recording from this ferret's retina. The other thing that they did was they made sure that there is no stimuli, which means they had darkroom setup. And when after the recording was done, what they noticed was that there were these spikes. They saw spikes, but they didn't see just sparse spikes happening, but they saw some sort of a wave pattern. So they saw these spikes, they're moving along some trajectory, or there is a wave that's actually moving. So they didn't know what was the source of this wave, nor did they understand why was this wave useful, or was this wave useful at all. But much later, when we came across this research, and when I got a chance to speak to Marcus, we figured that this seems like a very useful tool for us to actually grow and build out our system and probably self-organize our structures. So we thought, why don't we just code up something and see if this way has something to do with building structures, or maybe it's just like a weird artifact of evolution. So what did we do? We basically abstracted some developmental algorithms from the brain to grow artificial neural networks. And as soon as we implemented this model, what we noticed is it gave us a lot of really cool properties. One is it basically made it flexible. I'll get into what these properties actually mean. And it made us robust, so you could actually cope with defects and damage. And it also gave us a chance to build reconfigurable network architectures. And also versatility was provided. Okay, so like I'll just show you the final product. This is like a simple 2-layered system that we had. Let's see if I just go back. Okay. All right. So here we have. So what we did is we basically did this. So what we wanted to grow a neural network, and we wanted to make sure that as the network grows, we want to also have these spontaneous spatiotemporal waves move in this, like traverse the network. And as the spontaneous waves are traversing the network, we want it to adapt and change the connectivity between different layers. So here we endowed a single cell with all these rules like division, migration, layering, and we also made sure that there is some sort of intra-layer connectivity. So here in this particular video, we have each black node is basically a single neuron, and the red ones are those that are spiking. So we know that neurons spike, and I'll just basically I'll get to the dynamics or the dynamical equations that actually control the spiking soon. But here, the spiking occurs due to pure noisy communication. Noisy communication as in there is leaky neurotransmitters, and sometimes these neurotransmitters are leaked out of one neuron and they cause the firing of another. And after that, due to a particular topology of connectivity between neurons, we end up seeing there are these waves of activity that emerge in the system. Following which, we also have growth to another layer. And these waves actually serve as a signal to actually change the connectivity between the different layers. I'm also going to take the opportunity to say that this idea of actually growing and using like a cellular automaton kind of model for growing these networks was something that was inspired by what my discussions and my work with Professor Vignesh during my BTP. So I'm extremely grateful for him sowing that seed of growing these networks long back, maybe like 6 years back. So it's pretty amazing. And then what we did is, so now that we have this network in a future work that we did, we basically showed that we can also now functionalize these networks. So we can start making these networks learn different digits, for instance. And we noticed that different areas in the second layer and third layer start firing up and start learning the different digits that are being represented or that are being fed through the network. Okay. So how do we go about growing it? Now coming to the crux. There will be very few equations. I just made it pretty, but if any more details are required, please feel free to ask me. So we built a modular toolkit. We have growth. So you have local rules local rules that basically govern division of cells. When should cells divide in a single layer? When should they migrate? When should they start layering up to higher layers? And finally, what kind of connectivity, local connectivity should we establish? In this particular scenario, we are basically establishing local excitatory connectivity. So neurons that are close to each other will be connected with positive connections. That means they will be glutamatergic, or not glutamatergic, glutamatergic connectivity. And the ones that are farther away are inhibitory. So they're GABAergic. So you have like GABA, GABA is a neurotransmitter that is being released. So we can define that as I would say the genetic code that is being fed to a single unit. After this growth, what we do is the self-organization process, where we start seeing noisy activity between neurons, starts producing these emergent spatiotemporal activity waves. And these activity waves start spinning up again more activity waves in the higher layers, and they change connectivity between layers. So you can start forming these pooling structures or self-organizing these spatial clusters through this noise-driven activity. Okay, so all right. So now coming to a bit of equation. So emergent spatial temporal waves. We have linear integrated and fire neurons. typically, when we think of a neuron, we know that actually when we think of any cell, every cell has some sort of membrane potential. But then neurons are kind of special in some ways because of there's an influx of ions through these ion channels. You can actually spike up the membrane potential, and once it crosses a certain threshold, there is no turning back, and the membrane potential goes all the way to, let's say, 40 or 50 millivolt. That's the neuron's potential, and then afterwards comes back below the resting membrane potential. So you have like a spike. To implement that, usually people implement something called a linear integrated fire neuron system, and the idea is there are two parameters. There's a voltage, which is the membrane potential, and there is a threshold, the threshold parameter, which is if the voltage crosses the threshold, I want the neuron to fire. Usually the threshold is fixed. For a conventional, typical linear integrated fire neuron model, the threshold is fixed. That means, let's say I fix the threshold at 1. So every time the voltage goes above 1, I fire. If not, I don't fire. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to make a homeostatic system. I wanted to say that because I don't know what kind of input my network will receive, I want to make sure that I want to make sure that neurons are never idle. That means there should not be a scenario where they never reach the threshold, and also there should never be a regime where they're always firing. So to incorporate that, I basically have the threshold kind of adapt itself depending on its firing history. So a neuron kind of knows its firing history, and based on that, it would adapt its threshold to make sure that it doesn't fire too much nor fire too less. And the other thing is how are neurons connected with each other. So as I mentioned, we basically have this local excitation and global inhibition, which means, say for instance, I have a single neuron, which is like this red neuron here. It's connected to its local vicinity with positive connections, and it's connected with its like far away neurons with negative connections. And the negative connections kind of decay over time, so it's not like a globally connected system, but the connectivity tapers over time, so over spatial distance. So you have, so it is still biologically plausible. Okay, so this is an example where we have like noisy activity in the first layer, and that noisy activity, once it reaches a particular, I would say a particular fixed point in the dynamical space, it starts, it forms the spatial temporal wave activity. Now this wave activity starts spinning up other waves in the higher layers, in second and third layers, and as we have the activity in the first and second layer, we are also constantly, we need to start changing the weights and connecting layer 1 and layer 2. So we need to have some sort of a system or some sort of a dynamic learning rule to change the weights between these two layers. And for doing that, we have a dynamic learning rule. The dynamic learning rule is the spike timing dependent plasticity. It's a big term. Basic idea is, say you have neuron 1 and you have neuron 2. Neuron 1 is connected to neuron 2. Every time if neuron 1 fires, followed by neuron 2 firing, that means there is a causal relationship between neuron 1 and neuron 2, and the connectivity between neuron 1 and neuron 2 gets emphasized or gets increased. Whereas, for instance, if neuron 2 fires before neuron 1 fires, which means that either connection, which means that basically either information could be flowing from neuron 2 to neuron 1, or if there is a unidirectional connection, you would not, that means there is no information, or there is no information that's flowing from neuron 1 to neuron 2. So therefore you would decay the weights. So we have a fancy Hebb's rule. It's called Hebb's rule, named after a philosopher, a psychologist actually, Donald Hebb's, in the 1940s, and he described this particular learning rule for how neurons. The idea is neurons that fire together wire together. So basically, that's the most, I would say, simplest learning rule that is present in learning these neural systems. Okay, moving on. So now we couple both the emergent wave. So we have the spatial temporal waves, and we have the dynamic learning rules. And what we noticed is we started seeing these pooling networks. And an example of that is here. Say we have 3 layers here, and I'm going to show you a description of of the 2 layers. Let's say we take 2 units. So I take a unit. Let me take this 1 second. So here, yeah. So I take a unit here. Let's say I take this unit, a unit here, and I want to know how is this unit connected to this layer below. And this unit, basically, the connectivity is demonstrated out here. So initially it is randomly connected. So this unit is connected to, this is layer 1. And all the neurons it is connected to in layer 1 is represented by yellow, and all the ones that it's connected to are not connected to is blue. So after the self-organization process, what we notice is the same unit is connected to only a small patch of neurons. Whereas, and in a similar way, when you take a single unit from layer 3 and you look at the connectivity before and after, you start seeing that there are small patches. So it's connecting to a small patch. That means it is getting spatially clustered information from the previous layer. So so far we've been successful in actually self-organizing these pooling structures purely from noise-based activity. There is no data that is being fed to actually cluster or to form these pooling structures. So now coming to the features. So now a natural, I would say, byproduct of this developmental algorithm was that it gave us some really cool features which we never actually expected earlier. One is flexibility. So it allowed us to form pooling structures, not just from square layers, but from any arbitrary geometry. It also allowed us to be robust, reconfigurable. So here I have, let's say, for instance, you have, so typically when we think of sensor arrays, we think of sensor arrays as 2D, two-dimensional. But say, for instance, we have curved sensor arrays, which is being currently developed in the HPC labs. So if I want to now start integrating information from such sensor arrays, how do I go about, like I would have to either rebuild my system from scratch, or I would have to, ideally rebuild my system and then actually figure out how to like sample from all these different pixels. But what we've noticed is we can actually let these spontaneous spatiotemporal waves traverse the system, and we can start pooling from these structures very easily without actually caring about what is the specific geometry that we're pooling from. We can also like go to an arbitrary shape like a torus-shaped structure where we can have these waves traverse the torus or traverse the donut, and then we can start seeing that we can form these pooling structures from this kind of geometry as well. Another thing about robustness was that we can start damaging sensors in the first layer, and we would notice that the spatial temporal wave would actually make sure that these units wouldn't basically be sampled from, and we would start getting information from only relevant useful sensors. So therefore, we would be robust to malfunctioning units, and we would not be getting junk data from any of the malfunctioning units. And this is a very rapid process, so you very rapidly can keep changing the connectivity in order to accommodate for any changes that might occur in real time. Yes, the reconfigurability part is basically that we can change the size and shape of the connectivity itself. Say, so far I've been clustering from a small set of units from the first layer. So they could be like either you could change the size of the pooling layer that you're sampling from, or you could also change the shape of the pooling layer. And when you have like these orientation bars, what I have here is I have units that can start specifically responding to different orientations of the input. So it becomes some sort of an edge detector just for free. So you can self-organize an edge detector without having any, just purely through noise-based activity and a developmental algorithm. So that was like a very, I would say that's a very interesting feature that we gained just through adding this developmental algorithm. Okay, so I'm going to jump to functionality. The only thing is I'm unable to see anyone's faces through this Google Meet, so I'm unable to gauge if people are following or not. But after I'm done with this, please feel free to ask me questions on anything. So functionality is I'm going to talk about three areas. So the one is a motion task, which is very relevant to neuroscience. I'll describe what the motion task is as a gesture capture application, where we basically show that we can in real time learn different gestures, and we can start actually performing different tasks using our networks. And we can also very quickly, without having to make any architectural changes, scale up to multiple cameras or sensors. Say, for instance, if I'll get to it. Okay. So what is the motion task? This is a very, I would say, quintessential visual task in neuroscience. Any visual neuroscientist would definitely know about this and would have trained their models, be it a mouse model or a primate model or even a fish model, to actually discriminate to perform this task. So the idea is this. So they have all the animal or the human or the subject is seeing a screen. It sees a screen of moving dots. Now these dots could be moving. They're all moving in one direction, and the dots could have some level of correlation with each other. So let me make sure I have my pointer. So in the third scenario, what we have is so we have 100% correlation where all the dots are moving towards in the up direction. Here we have 50% where you have 50 of the, or let's say 50% of the dots that are moving in one direction, whereas others are actually moving in arbitrary directions. And in this case, everyone's moving in uncorrelated ways, or there's no bulk motion that is visible. So the task is that when the animal or when the subject sees this moving dots, they are supposed to label it as either signal or as noise. So they get a chance. So if it's a monkey, the monkey gets a chance to like push a lever either to the right or to the left. Or if it's a fish, for instance, the fish gets to wiggle their tail either to the right or to the left. It's really amazing to see actually zebrafish and both monkeys perform these tasks to figure out if it's going left, right, or if there is noise or signal. All right, so now this is going to show how this task looks in my hand. So here, this particular thing is 100% coherence, which means that all dots are moving upwards, like as you would notice. And this is an extreme where you have like 0% coherence, where everyone's just like random out here. There is no bulk motion, or there shouldn't be any bulk motion, because that's how we've simulated this. And these are differing levels of coherence. This task, although is performed by many subjects, be it primates up to the zebrafish, it's actually a very difficult task for a neural network to perform this, or a conventional machine learning system to perform it. Mainly because if we need to extract patterns, we need to actually have suitable systems that can integrate over time. And if you see, conventional machine learning systems are primarily very good for, extremely well suited for static pattern recognition, as well as if they have to be used for dynamics, they basically need a lot of tuning. Like for instance, if you're using a recurrent neural network, they face problems like vanishing gradients, or they face problems like exploding gradients, for instance. So we'd have to do a lot of tweaking and tuning of the parameters to even get them to function for tasks that probably primates can do. Like it's a back of the hand task for a primate. So I compared this. So we try to see how our networks perform, because our networks are they are a dynamical system, and they are constantly integrating over time. So I was curious to see how we perform, and the good thing is we do pretty well for this. So we get, even at a very low coherence, we can actually classify whether there's a signal or not at close to 90% mean. There are some glitches out here when it's 50% coherence for some reason. That is primarily because that's possibly because our networks don't have the perfectly right time scales, because we are not like tuning those parameters beforehand. We just randomly initialize the parameter system, and we let homeostasis actually try to make sure that neurons fire at the right time. Okay. The next application that we're going to speak about is the gesture capture application, which is basically, say for instance, we have people showing different gestures. So you have like moving your hand up, or you could be moving your hand left, right, and you could be moving your hand right to left. And the other is just like, I would say, clenching your fist. So what we notice is we can actually, this particular video is where I train and I test simultaneously, and I see that it can be trained and tested within a few seconds, which means, and you can also see that, and one thing that I've noticed is our systems can generalize pretty well to unknown gestures as well, which and that capability is provided primarily because of because of the spatiotemporal wave. So the spatiotemporal wave actually serves as a medium for clubbing multiple pixel, multiple pixel intensities together in an attempt to actually generalize between slightly different, let's say, slightly different images or slightly different inputs. So the spatial temporal wave actually is a pretty useful feature for even generalization to such dynamic tasks. Okay, and now the fun part is where we thought, okay, we can do all these things. It's great. Now, say for instance, we have as I'm interested in like scaling this up to a company, and we're actually working in that front right now. We'd like to interface with many cameras, many sensors, and we'd not want to spend a lot of resources on trying to employ someone to actually tune and tweak before we can interface with, I would say, maybe 100 sensors or 200 sensors or 200 cameras. So we tried a simple mock-up. We said, okay, if you look at the scallop, so people have heard of the scallops. Scallops actually have 200 eyes. I mean, that was something very shocking to me when I read it for the first time. It's beautiful because the scallop's eyes are basically made out of, they're mirror. They are not lens like we have corneal lenses, but they have mirrors. And light actually doesn't enter, but it bounces off the mirror and it reflects and falls on the retina. So this region, so here you have, these are the mirrors and these are the eyes of the scallop. And this area up here is the retinal region. So light entering here falls on the retina up here. And the question can be asked, how does the scallop integrate information over all these 200 eyes? Is there like a central processing engine, or how is it, or maybe there are like local processing engines? How is it scaling up so well? And what does it do if there are eyes that are malfunctioning or there's no information from some areas? How does it still integrate and perform its task? What we noticed was our algorithm can actually answer some of that question and can also scale up in a similar fashion. So I have a demo of up to 4 cameras that it can scale up to. And here, a very simple example is every time we're playing, let's say, every time you have these 4 screens that show the same input, you're making sure that the network learns how to say it's the same input. Whereas if they're all showing different inputs, we're saying that the network is making inference that no, they're all different. That is a different input. So we can scale up very quickly or very easily to a large number of cameras and sensors. I've so far, even over I would say a few hours of work, I can show that we can scale up to 50 cameras and sensors. Whereas conventional AI systems, it's a lot more, I would say, involved to actually scale up to such sensors in such short time or without good amount of tweaking and tuning. So I think there is a lot of potential in this area, and we have been very fortunate that my advisor has also been excited about this, and we are actually pushing this out as a technology soon. So so that actually opens it. So now that I'm speaking to people in IIT, if anyone's interested in collaborating with us or interning, we're definitely looking for people to help us and work on this. If you guys are excited, if anything captures your interest. Okay, so finally, I'm going to quickly summarize. I think not bad. I made it in reasonable time, I guess. Okay. So our brains continue to remain an exciting repository of mysterious mechanisms. And what we've shown is these growing networks, they endow systems with a lot of functionality, as flexibility, robustness, reconfigurability, and it also is scalable to multiple input sensor feed. A few thoughts that I'd like to share and probably open up discussion on is, would scaling up current ML systems actually take us to human intelligence in a sustainable fashion? That's something that I'd like. I feel in some sense that the way we are scaling up with machine learning systems currently, going from 1,000 to 10,000, 100,000 to billion parameters, using the same set of algorithms, same set of strategies to learn, might not be the best route. Because I feel we are very far away from, I would say, AGI or artificial general intelligence. For instance, an example comes to mind is the machine that built Alpha, that does Alpha, the AlphaGo machine, which basically beat Lee Sedol, Go champion. If Lee Sedol wouldn't have come to the venue and actually played, AlphaGo wouldn't have known that I need to go to that place and actually play the game. It just knows Go. That's it. It knows nothing else. So we need something that is slightly more malleable to, or understands the world if we do. So if we want such a system, how do we get there? What's the paradigm that we need to actually take? the other thing is the learning rule that the brain uses is something that's still mysterious to most of us. We have a lot of ways to change synapses in like activity-driven synaptic changes, but what's the golden learning rule? Like, where is the error evaluated? Is there an error function? What is the error function? In machine learning, we have clear labels. Say we have cat label, dog label, and so on and so forth. But what kind of labels do we have here, and how do we actually how do we learn? That's a very big question in some sense. And the other thing is, so far I've talked about like growing cortical structures. How do we actually grow subcortical structures? How do we grow hippocampi? Because hippocampi is like the storage of memory in some, or at least short-term memory. So how do we grow those kinds of structures? And finally, another like very open philosophical question is: are our brains everything, or is there more than the brain? So where is the thought, the mind, for instance? Are they just manifestations of the brain? Are they epiphenomena of brain activity, or is it more than that? These are like, I would say, very broad open questions, but something that excites me and I keep thinking once in a while. So yes, with this, I'd like to thank you for your attention and would like to open it up for any feedback, questions, comments. Let me stop presentation.
Thank you so much for that intriguing presentation. I think it gave me a lot of perspective personally, like total change in perspective. I think all of us are also having a lot of questions. If you have any questions, please feel to switch your videos on and you can ask him directly, or you can even put it in the chat box. Yeah.
Hi, Guru, great talk. It was amazing. The entire project, everything. It was very cool. I have a very small question. So you'd mentioned that while you're building the system, okay, this is very earlier in the slides. I don't remember the slide number, but there was this idea where the closed cells are glutamatergic. Sorry, closely spaced cells are glutamatergic, and farther the cells are, they send inhibitory stimuli. What's the idea behind it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's partially bio-inspired. So the way we've thought of it is local excitation and global inhibition is a very it's a motif that many biological systems use. Even, for instance, pretty sure I remember. I think Karthik must have mentioned in one of his classes. And so even cell walking or cell migration also, even how pseudopodia actually release, or how these different pseudopodia actually are released, that also has some sort of local excitation, global inhibition mechanism. So we basically wanted to use this mechanism because it is also seen in the in retinal ganglion cells. The specific connectivity is of that flavor. However, having said that, there is one small thing that isn't very purely biological, which means when you have you heard, there's something called Dale's law, which basically states that a neuron can either be only excitatory or only inhibitory. There are very few exceptions observed for this, but in our case, we basically we've designed the system in such a way that there could be a neuron doesn't have any particular, I would say, position or I would say occupation, but it could have some synapses being excitatory and some could be inhibitory. So we this local excitation is a very it's a very well-known motif, and that's why we started off with that. And once we actually wrote down the math, we realized that actually the dynamical system that it provides also has these fixed points which are like stable bumps in the, or if you call your bumps of activity. And when you actually the idea is when you add noise to the system and when you destabilize the bump, you actually get a traveling wave. So that's the idea behind why we chose this particular motif. Yeah.
Cool. Great. Thanks.
Hey, so Guru, great talk. So I have one question. So I'm obviously not so much from the neuroscience side of things, but I think towards the end you were talking about how quickly you can train and how fast you can adapt to lots of cameras and things like that. So can you somehow evaluate this on a per capita sort of computational effort or something like that? So how does this rank with respect to, does this really perform much better than any of the other approaches and so on, right? It looks like that might really be the case here.
That's so you mean with respect to the when you say computational, you mean with respect to the amount of RAM that it takes up, and is
yeah,
that
so so something like is, because you also said the word sustainable, right? And I also often think that we are the Googles and the Microsofts are building like I mean, of course they're trying to work a lot on sustainability and so on, but they're building like very large models, very expansive things, very deep networks, and very computationally intensive in the end, right? So and on the other hand, we've obviously given up on CPUs and gone GPUs simply because CPUs aren't efficient at all, right? Power per watt, flops per watt is the problem there. So if you were to for a task like you were saying, right, motion detection or gesture detection and so on, is your performance in terms of number of flops that you take to detect this, is it way better than some of the other methods perhaps? I'm not sure at all. This is just like a random thought.
That's a good question, actually. I haven't evaluated the flops per se, but if because
flops is probably overkill, but something like some approximate computational complexity or something like the number of operations or time might be the simplest place to start, but yeah.
Right. So the advantage actually we get is on if you look at it just like memory wise, for instance. We do get some advantage because we have that our final output is spike output, whereas usually machine learning systems output is already in real values. And so it'd be like let's say, for instance, every activation, maybe let's say you have your input, which is let's say in your network you have 100 nodes. And 100 nodes means you have in a typical traditional machine learning system, you have 64-bit float numbers or probably even 32-bit. Let's say even if they reduce to 32-bit also, you have like already 3200 bits basically used for these 100 nodes. 100 nodes is a really small system, but we actually are communicating only due to like binary changes, like 1 zeros. So you already have like just looking at activation itself, we have a very low memory, I would say, memory consumption itself. The other thing is that because we have these pooling structures, what we notice is that the connectivity can actually, even if we make the entire connectivity also binary, we are actually saving up a lot more on like memory usage. So that's one I would say that's one comparison. The other thing is because these are spike powered, we can actually implement them on neuromorphic systems. And when we start thinking of neuromorphic systems, there is one fundamental difference between current architecture and neuromorphic is that in current architecture we have we have the von Neumann architecture where you have this memory bottleneck. So you have you have the input, you have your memory, and then afterwards your processing. So every time you need to compute something, you need to go access back from your memory, and so that becomes your bottleneck. Whereas here you have like much more. It's a non-von Neumann architecture, so you have like multiple. I would say your information or your memory is basically more distributed. So the amount of time that would also take is further reduced. So incorporating it on neuromorphic might be more advantageous in some sense. I hope that, but that's that's one thing I could like off the top of my head say.
Yeah, but really cool, right? And see because if it's a little less expensive or a little simpler, low memory and so on, the kind of devices it can go and sit on really changes, right? I mean, you could put it on a watch, you could put it on like a chip, you could put it on a sensor and all kinds of things. So really interesting. Very cool work, Guru. Congrats.
Hey, I had a couple of questions.
Yes.
Yeah, the first thing is that you were telling that the brain follows the von Neumann architecture, right? But I mean, you're saying that the memory is distributed throughout the.
May not, like brain might not. Like current computer architectures follow von Neumann.
Okay, so the human brain is like some analog of the Harvard architecture, right?
Some analog of the.
Harvard architecture. I mean, the input and memory are in different parts of it.
Yeah. At least like because if you like, for instance, the synaptic weights in the brain already are like a local repository of the memory itself in some sense. So we basically like there is a change to the hardware at all points of time. That which is the synaptic, which is stored in the synaptic weights in the brain, whereas that's not the case in our conventional computer architectures.
Okay, so
That's
you're saying it's like a distributed system.
Right.
So, and you were also talking about like how different perspectives of the same input. I mean, when it passes through a network and things. So, like, say, let's take the example of the human eye, and we receive one input from each of the eyes. So both of these information go to the same place in the brain, or even they are distributed. Like,
That's a good question. Yes, actually. So let's see. So for instance, if you look at actually information from both eyes go to the, it's not a very, I can draw this out, but okay, let's say for instance, you have the right visual field and the left visual field. Okay. So the right visual field is captured by both eyes. And and information from both eyes of the right visual field is sent to the same area. And information about the left visual field from both eyes is sent to the same area. Does that make sense?
yes, kind of.
Okay, so like for instance, let's say if you're looking straight forward, okay, all the region to the right is the right visual field. So the area to the right is the right visual field, and the area to the left is the left visual field. Okay, and information from the right visual field. If you draw like a ray diagram, you will actually see that information from the right visual field goes to both the eyes, and information from the left visual field also goes to both the eyes. But then when you take the information from the eye all the way back to like the first layer, the LGN, the lateral geniculate nucleus, what we see is that there is this crossover, which means that information from the left visual field from one eye can cross over and go to the right LGN, whereas information from the right visual field from one eye can go cross over and go to the other. So you can basically, you are not clustering based on eye specific, but you're clustering based on visual field specific. So you're keeping I would say you're basically maintaining the visual field outside same. They don't really care about the organ that's actually accepting the information. So that's the thing that that's how our eyes are designed. The information are wiring.
Okay, yeah, thanks. And one last question. So,
yeah.
So, I mean, human brains may be like a humongous task to emulate using artificial neural networks, but has there been any work on emulating like the brains of the organisms which evolved the first brains or something, say the planarians?
Yeah, that's a great question actually. I mean, I know. I remember when I was in INSTI also, there was a senior who was working on this. So they've tried to like completely build a C elegans. Like C elegans has only 302 neurons, and they also know like everything about C elegans pretty much. They know every gene in C elegans. You know everything in C elegans. So what they're now doing is they're trying to like build a perfect model of the C elegans. But I feel like they've not yet. This is my understanding of what I've read so far. But there could be like recent changes that might so don't hold me to it. But what I understand is still they have not been able to decode exactly, like they're not been able to predict the C elegans perfectly yet. There is something that is still elusive. Could be, I don't know what it is, because they are currently modeling every neuron in the C elegans system. So I think that is a very, if you're interested in modeling like small tiny systems, that's like a perfect place to start. And there's like a whole open source group also on like computational modeling the entire C elegans, from the hydraulic structure to every gene in its system to every neuron. So maybe that's something you could possibly explore. I mean, you've heard of C elegans. C elegans is this one actually, the nematode. So the very famous nematode.
Thanks.